Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 169. Well, stay tuned for a special edition episode this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Pastor Todd Bordeaux of Cornerstone Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Houston, Texas. How are you doing, Todd?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for asking. We're going to do something different tonight. It's a special edition, as you said, and it's a special edition because we're sort of veering off using the works of Meredith Kline. We're going to talk about abuse in the church. And so, obviously, it's a topic we keep hearing about and reading about, and especially in our circles, of course. And so we're going to address that as a special edition, and hope it's helpful to the broader Christian community.
Okay. Well, before we wade into that subject, I will just briefly remind our listeners that we do have our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast. There they can find all of the resources that we mentioned during the course of an episode. We would sure appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and to subscribe to the podcast on whatever you use to listen to it. Both of those things really help to boost our visibility as we produce good theological content. And finally, if you have the means to pitch in a little bit of money to help us cover the monthly cost of hosting the audio files, you can find a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And any amount that you can give is really encouraging to Todd and me. And if you don't like the PayPal option behind the donate button, just reach out to us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com and we can figure something else out. So, having said all of that, Todd, where would you like to start with this special edition?
Well, I want to start off by saying I don't consider myself any type of expert, only that I've been dealing with abuse in the church, addressing it, and dealing with abuse victims and helping them really since the late 1980s when I was a young youth pastor. My wife and I started getting calls. We were in a farming community in Central California, and we would get calls of somebody who's been abused, and sometimes we'd take them in our home for a couple days until they can heal a bit, and we'd be calling, dealing with CPS and things like that. So it really started as a youth pastor, and then after becoming an OPC church planner and minister, I've been addressing it and dealing with issues of abuse for at least 20 years in the OPC. So I'm going to offer some thoughts on that and pray that they can be helpful, simply based on my own experience in reading and writings, etc. So I want to start off with a definition of abuse, because everybody talks about abuse now in the church, and often people don't even have a definition of it. So the definition of abuse is maltreatment of people, using them for your own gain to their harm. So it's the maltreatment of people where you use them for your own gain and to their harm. So with that general definition, it's important to remember that when we talk about abuse, that abuse must include intent. Abuse comes from hatred, hate in the heart. It's a desire of the heart to hurt people and use them without any regard to their own well-being. And so to be an abuser means that you see people as objects to be used. And so when we talk about abuse, we're not talking about disagreements. And I say that because sometimes I'll hear people say, well, that church was abusive. And I'll say, what do you mean? Well, we believe this, and they said no, that's not our conviction, so we left. And I would say, well, a disagreement is not necessarily abuse. They just simply have a different view than you, and you didn't persuade them. And so they're holding to their conviction on whatever. And so abuse isn't a decision we don't like necessarily either. And it's not a temporary bad mood. Because everybody has bad moods and everybody says something that hurts people at times. That doesn't make you an abuser. Because an abuser has to include intent. It has to include, it comes from the heart. And so if I raise my voice, or if my wife raises her voice to me and we apologize, we haven't been abusive to each other. It wasn't our goal, our intent to harm. It just happens with sinful people. And so we have to remember what it is. And we see examples of this in the Bible, where it always includes intent. And there's two of them. One is Ezekiel 34, the abuse of shepherds of Israel, which says, "Ah, shepherds of Israel who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep? Yet you eat the fat, and you clothe yourselves with the wool, and you slaughter the fat ones, but you do not feed the sheep. The weak you have not strengthened, the sick you have not healed, the injured you have not bound up, the strayed you have not brought back, the lost you have not sought, and with force and harshness you have ruled them." And so we see in Scripture abuse are shepherds who are purposely hurting the sheep for their own benefit. And so they're ignoring the sheep because they don't care for them. But with harshness and force they rule them because they only care about feeding themselves. This is intent. This is an evil heart. And we see that in 2 Samuel 2 with Eli's sons. And of course they were priests in the tabernacle. And it says, Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. And then chapter 3, verse 2. Now Eli, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Again, we see many different types of abuse here. Sexual abuse, spiritual abuse. They were using their authority and their power as priests to hurt others. It was very purposeful what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. They didn't care. They had no heart for the people they were hurting. And so we need to be careful that when we use the word abuse, that we reserve it for what it really means. People who intend to hurt because they don't love. Abuse is the opposite of love. When you love, you care about them. You don't want them purposefully hurt. And so, now can you hurt and love at the same time? Yes. Simply because you say something wrong or you take a wrong approach. But it's not your goal to destroy people. It just happens. You can say in a marriage, often you can remember how your husband or wife hurt you. But if you say, well, does your husband love you? Oh, yes. But that particular day, he said something in a way that hurt. We wouldn't say that husband is an abuser.
Mm.
Because it doesn't come from an evil heart that simply and only wants to use and doesn't see you as a real human being. And it's important because we have to reserve the word for those who are experiencing it. We've talked about in theology and other areas that when you broaden the meaning of the word, it begins to lose its meaning altogether. And so there are people truly suffering abuse that they need to have our full attention. And so we have to use the word properly. Any thoughts on that before we continue our definitions?
I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I think that's good and right that abuse is something intentional, like you said, coming from the heart, and that I guess your last point there was that we can really only call people victims of abuse if they're actually experiencing it.
Well, and what will happen is if we don't narrow it down to the true meaning, abusers will use that. Because abusers, let's say a husband has been abusing his wife, maybe not even physically, but through cruelty for years. And he'll say to another man to get his sympathy, well, no man is perfect. We all say things we shouldn't say. We all have regrets. And of course, the truly humble man will look back and say, yeah, we all look back and have moments we regret we didn't say something right. And as soon as you generalize it to that point, the abuser seems to be getting away with it because he's getting everyone else to sort of agree with him. Instead of saying, no, what you're doing is actual abuse. It's not the same as someone who loves somebody just being in a bad mood that day or being upset. Don't try to correlate the two.
Okay.
Don't try to excuse true abuse by generalizing so much that everybody in the world becomes an abuser.
There you go.
That's the point. So abuse includes intent. And secondly, abuse includes knowledge. And what I mean by that is you can abuse by actually being an abuser, or you can be responsible for abuse by knowing about it and doing nothing. And we certainly see that with Eli, because he was held accountable for not rebuking his sons. 1 Samuel 3:12. At that time I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them. Now that blaspheming God includes all the abuse they were doing in the name of God. And so notice, because of the sin he knew about, that's the key. And he failed to restrain them. He failed to rebuke them. He failed to use his authority to stop them. And so to be responsible to cover up abuse means you have to know about the abuse. And knowing about it, you choose to continue to let it happen, like Eli was doing. That is the guilt of cover-up. And again, we have to be careful that when we see accusations of abuse, we have to be careful of broad brushes that don't make this distinction. So I've heard people say, let's say a pastor of a church, we found out he's abused somebody. You hear people say, that church allows abuse. Well, not always do the members of the church know that abuse is going on. They're not aware. Sometimes some of the elders don't even know. There may be one or two elders more in the inner circle that know what's going on. That pastor is sleeping with a woman in the church, and he's using his authority and persuasion, and the two elders know, but the other elders have no idea. When they find out, they do hold him accountable. It's not right, and it's unfair to say that church knew about abuse. Because for some, they didn't know. All of us who have been in ministry a long time have heard stories of colleagues that we worked with at one time or another, and maybe we haven't seen them in years, and we find out they're abusers. At the time, we didn't know, and maybe they hadn't even done their first one yet, but if they did, we didn't know. But we find out later, and we're all in shock. So that's a pretty common thing because abusers, for obvious reasons, are very sneaky.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't all see the signs. And so it's unfair to hold an entire denomination accountable unless you can demonstrate how the higher ups in a denomination knew something and are ignoring actual abuse. And so this type of thing where a few people know and the rest don't, it's really common in churches. And so if you're going to accuse people of abuse, we have to accuse people who, like Eli, who actually knew what was happening and let it happen, and especially those who were in a position to stop it. So abuse is intent, and abuse is knowledge. We actually know about it, not just associated with people who know. Any thoughts on that part about knowledge?
Well, just that one of the things, and I mean, I'm speaking out of complete speculation here. I've never stood in your shoes, Todd, so you tell me if I'm way off base here, but it seems like one thing that would make that knowledge part even more difficult is that you want to give your colleagues, your fellow ministers and elders, the benefit of the doubt about things. I mean, you don't want to be walking around constantly suspecting everybody.
Exactly. And we're called to give Christians the benefit of the doubt until evidence proves otherwise. It's the judgment of charity.
Yeah.
And that does make it very difficult. Well, my third point about abuse tends to be controversial, but I'm going to try to argue for it. And that is that abusers cannot be believers. Abusers cannot be believers. Because the Bible teaches that those who are born from above love the brethren. They love people. And if our definition of abuse is accurate, it comes from an evil heart that does not see other people as human beings, but only as objects to be used. And 1 John 4:20 is very clear on this. Whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother or sister, is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. So if abuse is a complete disregard for the well-being of people around you that you're using and destroying, the Bible says that demonstrates an evil heart, that you are an unbeliever. And why that's important is counseling will not change that.
Right. And we've talked about...
Yeah, go ahead.
I just was going to say, we've talked about that on previous episodes.
Right. Telling the wife, if she just does better, is not going to change an evil heart. Telling a husband, and I know that it's not always husbands against wives. It goes both ways, but I'll use that terminology. It's a little easier. Telling a husband who abuses his wife, and he says, well, it's just my job is so stressful. Change in a work environment does not resolve an evil heart.
Amen.
And so, if you're wondering if you're an abuser because you're worried about something you've ever done that's hurt someone, well, then you're not really an abuser, because abusers are never sorry. Because if you were truly repentant and sorry, that would be a believing heart. Now, an abuser, of course, can be converted, but the point is, abusers don't care about people. They care about themselves only. And that is the very essence of an unbeliever.
Right. So, I mean, you're talking about someone whose identity is abuser.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about this is what people do. If you're an abuser, you are an abuser. It's not like one time you did something. Well, you could do it one time, but it is the way you treat people your whole life.
Right.
And so it is the sign of an unbeliever, period. All right, you ready to move on?
Yeah.
All right, so let's look then at principles of abuse. The first principle is there are many types of abuse. The highest priority that we should deal with first and right away, of course, is sexual abuse or physical abuse. Number one, because they're criminal acts. And with criminal acts, we have to report them and protect the person immediately. Because with sexual and physical abuse, that person being abused is in immediate danger, or that person and the children. And so, in dealing with abuse, that takes our first priority, these type of criminal acts. That doesn't lessen the long-term damage that other types of abuse can do. I'm just saying that when we hear stories of abuse, and we have to act immediately with sexual or physical abuse that we hear about. This is not something you wait, pray about. You have to act. You have to call the right people, the right authority immediately. Now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Psychological abuse or emotional abuse is abuse. It does break down a person. It does destroy them. But typically it destroys them over a long period of time. But it's just as ultimately damaging as any other type of abuse. It's if you live with somebody who hates you, they are destroying you. And that destruction includes physical destruction. We are not wired to live every day with someone who hates us. We know that does brain damage, trauma does brain damage, and the body begins to wear down. So there is physical abuse when, even though he may not be hitting her, you are destroying a life if you're living with an abuser all the time. So we have to take that very seriously also. The third principle is that abuse victims can be abusers. Now we know that from history because this happens all the time. People who are oppressed, they fight for their freedom, and when they're free, what do? They oppress.
Exactly.
I mean, didn't we see that in the French Revolution?
Yeah.
The authorities had been using people. Then there's a revolution, and now those who had been abused became abusers.
Right.
And they began killing, the rich randomly, not even knowing what exactly they did. And so it's a principle that sinful hearts can be found in anyone, even abuse victims. They can, over time, just become abusive with others. And they can do that through false accusations. They can do that with mistreating others. And so sometimes when someone's been abused, when we see signs that they're actually abusing, there's a sense that they get a free pass. Nobody can say anything because they're beyond confrontation because of their own past. But we should not shy away from pointing out abuse, even among those who've been abused, because the Bible simply teaches anybody can be this way. And historically, we've seen this all the time, as I said. I mean, you know history-wise, isn't this a cycle of those who are oppressed get free and then oppress?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, like you said, it's kind of a general historical principle, but it seems like even people who counsel abuse victims as a vocation, it's what they do, report that people who have been abused often turn around and end up abusing others as well.
Right. Sometimes you see that family dynamic too.
Mm-hmm.
Children who were abused, they grow up to be abusers. That's a common problem. And so let's move on to reporting abuse. When you hear about abuse, the first thing you should do as a Christian is report it to the proper authorities. Depending on what it is, it can be the police, it can be CPS. If it's not criminal, if you're not sure it's criminal, report it anyways, to be on the safe side. because there's a lot of gray areas of what exactly is criminal. But report it. It may be to the president of an institution that it happened in. It can be a session, a presbytery, whatever it is. Always report it. Never keep it to yourself. And again, anything close to criminal. It used to be that you hear something and many years have gone by, you wondered whether to report it because of statute of limitations. But those laws are all changing in America. And statute of limitation laws on sexual abuse are all being rescinded, where there are no statute of limitations. And that already happened in California. So if you're not sure, it never hurts to report it. Always be on the safe side. Now, when it comes to reporting child abuse with CPS, or teams seems to be, and I've worked with CPS a number of different cases, as well as we had members in our church who were guardians for CPS, who worked within the system. And in the Christian community, there seems to be two extreme views of CPS. You've got the one side who sees them as evil, that their whole goal in life is to take children away from Christians who are caught spanking their kids. And so you got that view out there. And so they're not to be trusted. Then you've got the other view that sees them as superheroes. That assumes as soon as you make a call to CPS, everything's resolved. They're going to go in, they're going to resolve it, they're going to protect, and it's done. And neither of those are true. In real life, it's somewhere in the middle, like always, right?
Yeah.
And so in dealing with CPS, there are many variables. How much time has gone by, who's reporting. If the person who wasn't abused doesn't want to report, that makes it real difficult for them. Not impossible, depending on criminal activity, but difficult. What proof they have. Also, they have an incredible backlog of cases, especially now, by the way. And so the point is, if you have some oversight or help, don't assume a call to CPS just magically resolves everything. Often it doesn't. It is not necessarily their fault. They're limited on what they can do also. Now, any thoughts on that before we go to the next point?
No, I better not.
Okay. And so the general point is, and of course, in many places it's criminal if you don't.
Right.
But it's also just the right thing to do. If you're not sure, always call. Always call the authorities. I've called the police on a lot of things that they all end up telling me there's nothing we can do. But you just do it to protect your church, to do the right thing, and even if it goes nowhere, always make the call to the proper authorities.
You know what? I will interject something before we move on. I'm wondering what your opinion is about whether this principle that you're talking about right now should be talked about in Reformed seminaries, because I don't ever remember hearing it in seminary, but it seems like it's a problem that you're going to run into as a pastor.
Yeah, I mean, it's you, and I don't remember talking about it either, but you think in practical theology classes, these should be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
We should have some people coming in and letting them know how to do these type of things. Because sometimes guys get right out of seminary and they're at their first church, and within months they have an abuse case.
Mm-hmm.
And they have no idea what to do. Now, that brings us to the next issue with abuse is, what do we do with public accusations? This didn't used to be much of a problem before the internet. Now I'm old enough to remember those days. But now, a person can make an accusation within minutes, and it goes all over the world with social media. What do we do with these accusations that we're seeing? Well, first thing we do is take them seriously. And we have to be careful that there's a saying that proper procedure is the last refuge of scoundrels.
Mm-hmm.
You can over-procedurize things and nothing ever gets done because it's so hard to go through the procedure. Now, normally we should always encourage the proper authorities. That normally public accusations are not good because once they're out, and most people don't even know about it. And what if it's wrong? You can destroy people. So normally it's not a good thing to do. You should always go privately to the proper authority and leave it at them. But there are times when an abuse victim has tried that and it hasn't worked. And over time, they eventually do make a public accusation about abuse. The reason we have to take that seriously is what we said before, that abuse is a state of the heart, that once you start, you continue. And we know that even from police records. Very rarely does a man rape a woman once.
Right.
Very rarely does a man or a father or a mother abuse a child once. It becomes a way of life. And so there's a very good chance that that's still happening. Because an abuser's conscience has been seared. They don't have any empathy. They don't care what they're doing to others. And so if they can get away with it, they'll do it. Now, the second thing, though, is when this happens, the rest of the Christian community should refrain from commenting publicly if they're unaware of anything. Now, when I mean comment publicly, I mean take sides. Surely you can ask questions, but we must believe in the proper spheres of authority to resolve these things and not have this Wild West free-for-all of accusations where everybody jumps on a side and they don't even know these people.
Mm.
And so one of the rules of wisdom is you don't have to comment on everything. Right?
Oh, wisdom, not one of the rules of social media.
Right. It's Christian wisdom. I could probably find a lot of proverbs. You don't have to comment on everything.
Right.
So you can see these things happening in front of you, and you can commit it to prayer that justice would prevail and the abuse would stop. And if it's false, justice would prevail also. But I see a tendency, because everybody wants to be on the right side of everything. A public accusation goes out and people have no idea who anyone is, either the accuser or the one who's been accused, jumping on on their side, either to defend the person they want to defend or to jump on the accuser's side to show that they're against abuse. And this is sort of virtue signaling to get on the right side. Just leave it alone and let the proper people deal with it. Now, you may actually know more, and of course you have a little more right to speak if you actually know about this, but Christians need to be very careful with their words, including what they write. And so the proper thing to happen with a public accusation is the authorities, whoever it is, depending on the accusation, should investigate it. And they can't hide behind 1 Timothy 5:9, which often is done. Do not entertain an accusation against an elder unless it is brought, now, some translations, by 2 or 3 witnesses. And so you'll hear people say, well, if it's only one person making the accusation, we have to ignore it. That's certainly not true. And by the way, that wasn't true with Eli, was it?
No, it wasn't true at all.
Eli knew about it, and the Lord didn't say, well, you know about it, but you need a second witness.
Right.
Eli alone was supposed to investigate and confront. But the Greek there, and we don't have time to get into the Greek, is more likely, unless an elder, it is brought in the presence of or in front of 2 or 3 witnesses, is the idea. But I'll let the Greek scholars deal with that. But the point is, you can't hide behind that and ignore it.
Right.
So the proper authority has to investigate any public accusation. Now, the reason it goes public at times is because the person who's been abused, they've seen nothing has been done, and that person who abused that, him or her, is out there, and they start to feel a bit responsible that, could I stop this? And they've already tried local investigations and it didn't go anywhere. And so they're trying to do the right thing by exposing somebody. Now, at the same time, they can have a personal vendetta and use social media as a false accusation. Both can happen. But still, the seriousness of it, the fact that somebody may be in harm, means you have to investigate a public accusation. You have to take it seriously. And so, we'll stop there, but any other thoughts on that?
No, all wise counsel, I think.
You'll take the counsel of Proverbs?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about how to prevent abuse in church. And these are lessons that I've learned, and a lot of it is you just have to do this a long time to see patterns. I don't expect new pastors to be able to do this as well, but it's only because I've been dealing with cases for so many years that you start to see certain patterns and notice things. And so the first thing is to watch people. Everyone in church, if they're either an abuser or they're being abused, they typically put on a show. The abuse victim is not ready. They're afraid to speak out. The abuser, for obvious reasons, doesn't want anyone to see his true colors. And so they're putting on a show of spirituality, of everything fine. And so if you think that there's no abuse happening in your church, you're just naive. Because it just happens. It's just there. It's part of life. And so you watch people. Watch how wives react to husbands or husbands react to wives. Even watch their eyes. I've noticed when a wife is being abused for a long time, her eyes are sort of dead. And I know that's very subjective, and obviously you don't go by that alone. But as a pastor, you notice these things. You notice if there's life in the eyes, happiness, or if there's sort of a deadness. And so watch how they interact with each other. Watch if they're free. Are they free to be themselves, to relax, to disagree? Watch for overcompliance. Watch for a wife who's afraid to ever, even in a joking way, disagree with her husband. Watch for children who are too perfect and they're not free to be themselves. Those are sort of warning signs that not all is as it seems. Now, can you have a very compliant children? Yes, but anyone who's been a pastor knows how this plays out. And also, do not ignore unusual things that you see, incidents, stories, words. Because usually, as you said, you assume the best, but abusers end up giving themselves away by some odd things they say that normal people would never say. It could be an odd way of joking that made you uncomfortable. Could be an odd statement about someone else. If you start seeing these more than once, take those seriously, because that's often the first signs of an abuser. Secondly, respect women's intuition. Now again, this comes with my age, but when I was young, people always talked about women's intuition. Remember those days? You're probably old enough to remember those days.
I do, yeah.
And all of a sudden, we are being told in certain conservative circles that women should not trust their emotions. So we've gone from having this great respect for women's intuition to telling women not to trust their emotions. Because women's intuition is sharp. My wife is really good at that. She'll be around somebody and she'll come to me and say, I don't know what it is, but that guy creeps me out. And almost every time she said that, it ends up being true.
Or there ends up being something behind that, right?
Yes, something. And so you can't go on intuition alone, but it starts your careful watching process. Women who are being abused or they're around abusers, they often do have an intuition on guys. And so if any of them feel free to tell you, even your wife, take it seriously. Now, you can't make an accusation on intuition, like I said, but you can at least have your eyes open from that point.
Mm-hmm.
Thirdly, we must warn, and this is especially in Reformed circles, we must warn against theologies that lead to abuse. And you know, I've been addressing hyper-complementarianism now for 20 years. This new patriarchalism, this overemphasis on male headship. Whenever you overemphasize something, you open up doors for abuse. And that's true with anything. You may believe that tithing is in the Bible. And that's fine. As a pastor, you can believe that. But if you're doing a 10-part, a 10-episode or 10-week series on tithing, probably something's up. Right?
Right.
When you overemphasize anything that isn't the gospel, or whatever the passage is saying as you work through, it is just ripe for abuse. And so this overemphasis on everything being about male headship and authority, way more than the Bible is interested in it.
Yeah.
It becomes a breeding ground for abusers. They're drawn to that. You know, if you're teaching the wrong definition of submission in marriage, which basically allows a man to order his wife around. Yes, of course, they'll say ideally a man should love his wife, but their view of submission is even if he doesn't, whatever he tells you, just do, if it's not sin, and submit to it, which really isn't the biblical view of submission in marriage at all. Submission in the Bible is to have his best interests at heart, and that's how you serve him. It doesn't include covering up abuse or excusing it or allowing it, which is not really keeping even his best interests at heart, allowing him to get away with it. And all this literature, this terrible literature that, again, I just feel like a broken record, that's coming out of Moscow, Idaho, with Doug Wilson. This is just poison. This man is prophet, priest, and king of his home. The woman's purpose is to get married and have lots of children and to serve her husband. All this stuff that's unbiblical is simply a breeding ground for abusers. You're invited it in. Throw that literature out. Doug Phillip literature, the pearls, all this garbage. You can't allow this stuff and then be surprised when you see abuse happening in your churches. How many, how you got to pick sides eventually, right?
Right.
I mean, the amount of women who have cried out about the abuse under Doug Wilson's ministry.
Oh, yeah.
They're piling up. So either you stand against it or you allow it, but you can't sort of take a middle road and encourage the literature, but this stuff is truly damaging to souls. And so whether my own denomination or any Reformed denomination or Baptist, you're going to have to take a side on this, because eventually this is all going to break open what's going on and the damage it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, this most recent story we've heard of sounds like it drove the poor young woman right out of the faith, not just out of the church.
Yeah. Secondly, when it comes to theology that lead to abuse, an over-rigid definition of desertion that does not include providing for basic needs. Throughout church history, when we talk about desertion or sexual immorality, desertion usually has a broader meaning. And the rigid, you have to stay in your marriage no matter what he's doing, as long as he's not abandoning you or committing adultery. That's very novel, actually, in church history, to be so strict on that that you don't allow for any special cases. Now, we're not talking about marriages where there's tension or disagreements or even a lack of intimacy because one's a believer, one's not. Peter says in that situation, you stay with your husband. We're talking about when your well-being is in jeopardy, when you're crying out that the cruelty is destroying you. If you don't respond to this, if you simply tell the woman, God says you have to submit, then you're wondering why there's a continuation of abuse and even suicides, and then public accusations when there's nothing else they can do. Where it's very clear in the Old Testament that divorce was allowed when basic human rights weren't met, basic human provision. For example, in Exodus 21, we're told that if the husband doesn't provide food, safety, and conjugal rights to the wife, then he needs to let her go. She's free, and she can go remarry. So you see that God was always concerned with the woman. Of course, in our day it could be a man, but with the woman who was in danger of not having her basic needs met. And in Deuteronomy 21:11 through 14, a man who takes a wife as a prisoner of war, but takes a woman as a wife, it says he cannot treat her as a slave. Instead, he must let her go. And so again, it's the same idea. Not if there's problems in the marriage, but if he's treating her as a slave, and that's abuse, to treat a human being you're supposed to be in love with and treat well as a slave, then she's free to leave. And you're actually not allowed to even keep her as a wife if you're going to treat her as a slave. And so there's this modern conservative tendency to view desertion so rigidly that we force women to stay in marriages whose basic human needs aren't being met and they're in danger. Even Calvin in his ecclesiastical ordinances wrote, a woman is allowed to divorce in matters of impotence, which is, we would say, that they're not providing conjugal rights, and that would include not giving her children. But also Calvin wrote, and in matters of extreme religious incompatibility. Now he used the word extreme because these are special cases, not simply religious incompatibility, which you can have a Christian and a non-Christian married, and they can be taking care of their basic needs. But Calvin wrote extreme. And then, of course, William Perkins, as I wrote in my dissertation, spoke of intolerable cruelty. That if we see a woman who is experiencing continuous intolerable cruelty, where she cannot take it anymore, he considered that a form of desertion. And so you're going to encourage abuse if you don't have the wisdom and mercy of all church history, which saw extreme cases as something to consider.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that before I give one more?
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the patriarchalism and the things like that. It seems like in the Reformed community, it's only too easy to overemphasize things. It's fine to be excited about issues. I mean, I think you would agree about that. But then when that becomes like your pet issue, it really does set the stage for abuse in that area.
And the way they get away with it when it's their pet issue is they say things like, well, that's what the world's talking about. That's the issue out there. And so we need to be talking about it correctly. But you could say that about any pet issue.
Anything.
I could say, well, the reason I preach on tithing every week, because it's a greedy world out there.
Yeah, and it's a greedy heart in here, too.
Right. So, I can pick any issue and say, well, because the media talks about it a lot, I need to talk about it a lot. But anything you emphasize so much to the detriment of other qualifications and views that the Bible brings in, you begin to invite person obsessed with things like male authority. You don't want people who are obsessed with male authority.
Oh my goodness, no.
Now, finally, and I mentioned a little bit this earlier, you can address abuse and begin to challenge it by not being naive and relying on counseling, because abusers love counseling. One of the things I've learned way back since 25 years ago is abusers in the church love counseling because they know how to say and do just enough to keep whatever they're afraid of losing. And what makes that difficult is pastors love success in counseling. And abusers know that. Pastors love to be able to think that something I can tell them and get them to do will solve it. And so abusers, if you're that naive to think that after 20 years of somebody being like this, that you have the answer and telling them if you do this, then you're just inviting them to manipulate the process. And you're putting the abuse victim in many more years of harm's way. And so remember that the person closest to the abuser knows that abuser. And so listen to them. Unless that person has been demonstrated to be a liar with clear evidence, listen to them. Because they know the heart of the person they live with, that they're dealing with. But if you think you can always come in as Superman with a big S on your chest because of your counseling skills or techniques, that's very dangerous. That tends to perpetuate abuse. Instead of remembering that true abusers are unbelievers. And that's the issue. And so let's close with a couple thoughts. We haven't really touched too much on the issue of spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is a little more difficult to nail down because it's so broad, it's so difficult to define. Sometimes you know it when you're in it, but you can't even explain it. Sometimes it's when you're in a church where you cannot disagree with the leadership on any issue, even if it's small. You fear having a disagreement. Sometimes it's when there's so much legalism that you're afraid to be yourself because of the expectations from the leaders. Sometimes it's the leaders will gossip about you if they know you're disagreeing with them. And, there's triangulation going on if you're familiar with that. But spiritual abuse is really tough to nail if it's only spiritual. But it's common, it happens. The Pharisees were most famous for it. It didn't seem like they were physically abusing people. At least we don't see that in the New Testament much. But certainly spiritual abuse is what Jesus condemned them for. And so in one sense, no denomination can be free of abuse in any way. Fully. Because Jesus says wolves will always be among you. Whether in leadership or in membership, you're going to have wolves. And people with cold hearts, they can abuse. And so it's unfair to condemn an entire church or denomination simply because it's there, because there's no denomination or church that it's never there.
Right.
But we have to make sure that we address it, we teach against it, we report it, and we protect people. And we have to warn against practices that become breeding grounds. Some of the things we've said, and the type of literature out there that inspires this type of thing. And I'll end with this. And this is a really problem in conservative reform circles. We must emphasize that the very essence, the very basic fruit of the Spirit in the new covenant is love.
Yes.
Love for others is the fulfillment of the law. And this is where a wrong emphasis can be dangerous. And so what do we find in conservative reform circles? Sometimes piety is defined by formal obedience to the Sabbath, or having family devotionals every day, or submitting to church authority. But abusers can do all these things, and they often do. But what abusers cannot do is love with Christ's love. And so we must preach, we must teach, we must expect that love for people is the very essence of the law. And if you're not doing that, all this other law keeping is worthless and a stench in God's eyes and nose. And we must avoid this idea, and I hear this sometimes. Well, love is simply obeying the law. Well, you've just worked your way around not having to love.
Exactly.
Now, love includes obedience to the law, but love comes from a heart that cares for people so much they don't want them hurt. It comes from a genuine affection. It's not just law keeping. That allows abusers with that definition. Now, if you're not treating people around you in a way that you want what's best for them, even if they don't even see that all the time, or they have two different views. But if you're purposely hurting someone, that's the very essence of law breaking. Even in your words. If that's the lifestyle that you're known for in your home, in your marriage. So we must stay with the basics, which is genuine, heartfelt love for people, is the fulfillment of the law. It is evidence of the Holy Spirit in you.
And maybe just to broaden out a principle that you talked about on a past episode, if you have an appetite to use people, and that use could take a wide variety of forms, but I mean, if you need to use people and you have to feed that need, that's also something to be on the lookout for as well, wouldn't you say? I mean, an abuser is using people in lots of different ways.
Yes, in lots of ways. You can watch out for people who always use others for their own, whatever it is, their own praise, their own constant attention, their own service, where they view the person as just there for them, for their own needs. Mm-hmm. It can be an overbearing father who expects all the children simply to do everything he says in quick obedience because that's what he wants. And the wife, and I've seen wives do that with their husbands, where the husband is basically a slave to their needs. And there can be abuse both ways. So, yeah, it's the using of people without any care for how that's affecting them, just for your own needs.
Okay.
So we start with the criminal acts. That's what we have to address right away. But as we go out a little more broadly like that, we have to look for it and address it, whether it's in our teaching, our warnings, any other way. I'll stop there, but we went pretty long. But this is an important subject. Again, I don't ever want to be considered an abuse expert. I just hope, given all that the Lord has brought to me over the years dealing with this, if anything can help, I would be grateful.
Okay. Well, that was certainly not as joyful of a subject as we often talk about on this podcast, but I think it was necessary. So I appreciate you putting that together for us.
Thanks for saying it.
Well, dear listener, we would love to hear what you think. You can always email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us. I am at Machen Guy. Todd is at T Bordeaux. The podcast itself is at glorycloudpod. I'm also on Instagram as at Machen Guy. But you can also join the discussion over at the Meredith Kline Facebook group. Just let the admins know that you listen to the podcast and they can get you added. And we will be back again next week with another episode on Meredith Kline in the church.